Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome crewmates. This is our review of Agatha All Along. I've literally just binge watched all 9 episodes over the last couple of days so I can give you a full review and a breakdown of every episode and whether I think it is completely pointless. So let's get straight into it. In the very beginning of the series, in episode 1, we start off with this actually kind of cool like detective homicide kind of storyline and bit of a setting that's going on with it, which is actually kind of cool and sort of ties in with the way that WandaVision had a different kind of theme and a setting for each of its different episodes. So the way that this show starts is very much along those same lines, and you kind of get that impression initially that every episode is going to have a different setting and a different kind of era to it. And with this one, it's this whole homicide detective drama. Kind of feels like a Netflix show when it starts out, and it's actually kind of cool. But very quickly we start getting these little hints that there's something else going on. Little kind of like Easter eggs and words and things get mentioned. Things like mother, maiden, crone start getting used when characters are talking. So already you start getting like these witchy elements then start coming back into the show. And it's not before long that actually it gets pulled back into Westview properly, where we start to actually see the characters for real and not in this weird hex setup that's going on in their heads. We also very quickly get a mention of the Darkhold, which obviously ties in with Scarlet Witch and her demise in the Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness movie. So there's already these kind of throw-ins and tiebacks to where we are in terms of Scarlet Witch's story and throwing back to WandaVision. But as the episode goes on, we start hearing references to something called the Road, and what they're talking about is the Witch's Road. And the idea is that this road that a witch can go down will eventually give them what they want, and inevitably that is what Agatha is wanting to do, or at least that's what we think she's wanting to do. The difficulty for her is that she's got no powers, because after she's defeated by Scarlet Witch at the end of WandaVision and gets remained kind of trapped in the hex, she doesn't have any powers of her own. So her goal is to get her powers back, and that's going to play a really crucial part later on. But to begin with, we think that by going down the Witch's Road, she's going to get her powers restored, and that's the whole kind of crux of the storyline. She certainly can't get her powers back by any other means, because when Scarlet Witch dies in the end of Doctor Strange, all of the Darkholds and every copy of the Darkhold that has ever existed through time and space, allegedly, gets destroyed along with her. So they've got no choice but to go down the road in order to get powers back for Agatha. There's no other way to do it. There's no Darkhold anymore. By episode 2, we start to get a little bit more of an explanation. So the Witch's Road is this path which will give you the thing that you want the most. So in Agatha's case, it's getting her powers back. But we also then start to see this other character that has turned up when this random teenager breaks into Agatha's house and starts trying to steal things. At that point, we don't really know who he is or why, although, to be fair, it is quite easy to figure out. But in any event, he's the one that starts saying to Agatha, we need to go down the Witch's Road. There's something that he wants to gain from that as well. And so they set off effectively on this quest. The interesting thing about this and the way that it's constructed and the concept of it, it very much sort of calls back to what's known as the hero's journey, which is the way that storytelling is constructed. Luke Skywalker is the perfect example of that, where you're in kind of like your mundane situation, a character comes along that changes everything, and then you go off on a path and a journey where you have a load of upheaval and eventually you come out good at the end of it. It is a lot more complicated than that, but there's certain little elements that get placed in this particular episode of Agatha where we start to see that sort of same version of storytelling. In terms of the story and where we are by episode 2, effectively what they need to go down the Witch's Road is to create a coven. So they start to go off and recruit various other witches that they can pull into this. And this is Agatha and Teen, as he's now being referred to, going off and trying to find these other witches. But one of them is a really, I thought, not an Easter egg, but actually a perfect piece of casting. Patti LuPone is playing one of the witches that gets recruited into this coven so that Agatha can go off and do whatever it is that she needs to do. And Patti LuPone is playing a character called Lilia, and she is also a character from the comics. She's not a brand new character, but the casting of Patti LuPone playing her is brilliant, because what many people might not know is that she also played a witch, a really experienced and well-practiced, powerful witch in Penny Dreadful, which is like one of the best horror type shows that I've ever seen. It's one of my absolute favourites. So seeing her in this show not only gave it a bit of a kind of a cool reference, but also adds a massive weight because she is an epic actress. She is absolutely fantastic. So having her in this show actually gives it, I felt, a little bit more gravity and a lot more weight to it. And I kind of buyed into the show a little bit more simply because they had that casting in there. That was absolutely fantastic. So a little bit of a call to Penny Dreadful fans, I think. But the interesting thing about her character, Lilia, is that she's effectively a divinator. So she can kind of see things and look into the future and the past and is able to kind of interpret things. And it's obviously going to be really helpful for Agatha and Teen and the Coven going forward when they get into this perilous journey of going down the road. But one of the first things that Lilia does is she provides the names for who's going to be in the Coven. Now, the thing that was interesting about this is because at the time, how does she know the names? How does she actually get the names written on this piece of paper? How does she know that those are the witches that are needed for this Coven? Alongside that question, we also start seeing things appearing throughout the episode. And by that I mean various animals that keep kind of just cropping up randomly. So like there's a really random rat and a wolf and a raven that just appear, and Agatha stares at them almost as though she knows that they are someone listening and watching her. And straight away when you've got this weird kind of tone going on with those animals, again it's like Penny Dreadful full on. You've also then got the actress from Penny Dreadful who is being told, that's how it comes across, being told these names that need to go on the list for who needs to join this Coven. So straight away you're asking, well, who's talking to her and why do these animals appear? And straight away the question comes up time and time again, whenever we have anything supernatural in Marvel, is it Mephisto? So many times that character is asked and questioned as to whether he's behind all of this and that it actually is him kind of pulling the strings. And straight away by episode 2 in this series, we get the same question again. Is it actually Mephisto that's dealing with all of this? It's still a question that comes up every time there's a show like this, and Marvel have still yet to actually react to it. But there is a little Easter egg that comes up with that later. The difficulty that I had by this point in the series, by the end of episode 2, is that it really doesn't feel like a Marvel show. In fact, I texted Pippa at the time that I was watching it and said, this doesn't feel like Marvel. It feels like I'm watching Hocus Pocus. And that really kicks off even more in a few episodes' time. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I like Hocus Pocus, so that's not a, it's not a terrible thing, but it definitely feels like a Disney Halloween show, not a Marvel series. So there's a little bit of a detachment to it from me because I don't have that tie-in and that investment as a Marvel fan. It's fine for what it is, as a bit of a one-off show in this kind of weird horror vibe, little Penny Dreadful references, is it Mephisto and all this kind of stuff. There's enough there to kind of keep you entertained, and it is an entertaining show. It's worth watching, but it doesn't really seem to be tying into anything, and it feels very separate from anything else. You obviously get references to Scarlet Witch, the Darkhold, WandaVision, all those kinds of things, but ultimately it does feel very separate from everything else. And because of the difference in tone and theming and the way that it's set out and this Hocus Pocus vibe, it really doesn't feel like a Marvel product. So straight away, I feel like some fans might struggle with it. Interestingly, a lot of the reviews have been very, very good. But weirdly, I haven't actually seen any fan reaction, and I'm curious to know whether or not the kind of like die-hard Marvel fans actually stuck with this show. But then we get into episode 3, and now we are on the road. The Coven of Witches has come together, and we're now going down this road to give them all of their powers, which is essentially what all of them want. So they're going down the road, they have to survive it, they have to survive trials along the way, get to the end, and if they have survived, they should get what they want, which for the vast majority of them seems to just be that they want their powers back for whatever reason they've been taken from them at some point in the past. The first trial is very much a water-themed trial, so it starts to suggest that a lot of the elements in kind of witchcraft is going to start appearing later on. We'll see fire and air and earth and all that kind of thing. So this one is very much a water-based challenge, but it has a bit of gravitas to it in the fact that there's some real jeopardy. They might not actually survive these trials. They're quite life and death. Essentially what happens is that they end up getting poisoned, and one of the witches in the Coven who deals with potions, she has to essentially save them and find all of the ingredients within this house that they're trapped in before they all drown. So it's obviously got the water theme, witchcraft element themes, so there's all these kind of nice little tie-ins. But there's one thing that really stood out to me in this episode, was that someone used the phrase agent of Mephisto, referring to whether Agatha might be an agent of Mephisto, or maybe even Teen might be an agent of Mephisto. So now we're actually getting him name dropped in these shows. So he's still not appearing, but I think Marvel have cottoned on to the fact that a lot of us as fans are kind of chomping at the bit to actually have this character in there, and that surely he must be behind all of the supernatural stuff that happens within the MCU. So now they're actually name dropping him, which definitely I picked up on. I just, one day Marvel, put him in there. The interesting thing about this episode though is that they start to share the rumours amongst the other witches as to Agatha's backstory. And what they talk about is the fact that Agatha gave up her own child to get the Darkhold originally, or the Book of the Damned, as I think they actually refer it to in this episode. So the idea is that the rumour around Agatha is that how she got her powers in the first place was that she had to give up her own child, her own son, who way back in episode 1 we become aware of because we start seeing his room as it was like at the time that he had died, or at least in the confines of this detective homicide storyline. So we already know that there's this potential backstory of this deceased son that Agatha has. Now we're starting to get that tied in with rumours where other witches believe that it is because he was essentially sacrificed so that she could get her powers. So it's kind of just adding to her mystique and trying to give her this really kind of dark element to her as to, you can't trust her, clearly she's got evil intent and all this kind of thing. So she's very much being set up as the villain in this. And certainly she's an anti-hero. She is a villain at the end of the day. So it was just an interesting way to kind of keep that vibe going throughout the show, that she's not a superhero, she is definitely a villain. Naturally, by the end of episode 3, we start to lose some characters because not everybody survives these trials, but we move on to the next one, which is a fire-themed trial. Now, my I suppose in this episode, they save themselves by having to sing. And singing has already kind of played a little bit of a part in this show because that's how they open the door to get onto the road in the first place. It's a little bit of a personal thing. I don't really like the whole musical side of it, which is weird as someone that likes Disney, but it just, for me, it really detracts from the story. And almost kind of pulls you out a little bit because the music is, well, I mean, by the end of the series, the theme song that they have that they keep on singing is driving me absolutely nuts. So it doesn't really sit well with me. How is it that you've got these like 5-6 random witches getting in a room that can magically all sing perfectly and all know how to play instruments? I mean, it's just a little bit convenient, and all of a sudden we're in a West End musical. So I don't like it. That's a personal thing. It probably doesn't bother other people, but it does bother me. And by episode 4, we've already had these 2 different instances where music and singing is involved in order to make stuff happen. I wouldn't even say that that's necessarily a witchy thing. It's just, obviously it is in this show, but it isn't necessary in my opinion. It could have been done a different way that would have been a little bit less grating and a little bit less irritating, in my opinion. By episode 5, we go full on hocus pocus because now we're dealing with a little bit of backstory with a group called the Salem 7. The Salem 7 are the ancestors of the original coven that Agatha kind of killed, where we see it actually in WandaVision, where she's actually put at the stake by her coven, and they want to end her for whatever reason. But in attacking her with their powers, Agatha actually manages to take that power and harness it, not be defeated by it, and in doing so drains the life out of all of them. So the Salem 7 are actually the ancestors of the original coven who Agatha had defeated and killed. So we've actually got a weird little kind of tie-in to what had happened in her story in the WandaVision show. And the Salem 7 are quite dark and quite creepy, and good Halloween-y horror vibes that they provide. They kind of just remind me of Death Eaters to some extent from Harry Potter. So, you've got all these elements of different things kind of coming from other shows like Penny Dreadful, like Harry Potter, there's all of these things. And in the outgoing credits at the end of it, you even get like Lisa Simpson appearing in her witch costume from a Halloween episode, and you get references to The Wizard of Oz, and you get references to the Evil Witch from Disney shows. There's all of these kind of cultural pop references that go in there, it would drive Tony Stark mad. So it's just one of these things that really goes full on in episode 5. So we see the Salem 7, but the thing that is really full on hocus pocus is the fact that now we get witches' brooms being used, where they literally do use them to fly away. And I mean, it just gripes with me quite a lot because it's so unbelievably gimmicky and cheesy and kind of stupid. And this is where it's like, it's full on hocus pocus, and I don't really feel any connection to Marvel when it does things like that, because you think back to 2008 to 12 when we had Iron Man and those original movies like Captain America and Thor. Now we've got witches flying on broomsticks. It's just, I feel like we're missing a mark here. But I know and I'm aware of the fact that Marvel is a really diverse thing. You know, it's not always one type of story or one type of character. It has always been designed to appeal to a very, very wide audience. And with this show, we're just pushing it out even wider. But what this particular episode does do is it pulls it back into a little bit of a horror kind of vibe, which is cool, because once they get into the next trial, it involves them using a Ouija board. And when they're using it, they start speaking to death, which is really interesting because another character has appeared to join their coven during the trials while they're on the path, named Rio, who has definitely backstory with Agatha. We can tell that much by this point. The difficulty is that when you know who that character has been cast, or rather the actor has been cast to play, we know how this is going to turn out, so it's a little bit weird. But she's there, and coincidentally they start speaking to death through the Ouija board, and you actually get Agatha's original coven members turning up saying that Agatha should be punished in order to pass this particular trial, and it becomes all creepy and scary and blah 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 blah, so it just becomes a bit of a thing. The thing with this particular episode is that we start seeing little bits of who Billy really is, or Teen as he's been referred to. He's actually Billy Maximoff, and it becomes incredibly obvious by this point. I think that the show was written in a way where you would actually believe it to be Agatha's long deceased son, but I never bought into that idea. I assume that that's what the writers actually wanted you to think, but at no point did I ever believe that. I always felt like this was Billy Maximoff. There's just something about it. So for me, it wasn't really a bombshell. For me, it lost all impact whatsoever because I was like, well, yeah, do we not know that already? So to me, it was just too obvious and just didn't really have that punch that it really should have done in name dropping him. Also, the slight issue is who cares about Billy Maximoff? I mean, this is the thing. We're all supposed to be, oh my God, it's Billy. Who cares? By episode 6, genuinely, I was starting to get a bit bored. And this was a bit of a problem. And again, I text Pippa and said, I'm bored now. To which she replied, oh no. So it's just a bit of a thing. I think that you always kind of get these when you have, 6, 8, 9, however many sort of episodes in a show, especially with Star Wars shows. You always get this midpoint where they just get a little bit drawn out and a little bit boring, and the things that are supposed to have impact just don't hit the mark. And it's just a little bit tedious, I think. So by episode 6, I was starting to struggle. Episode 6, I also would say, if you're anti-woke, you're going to absolutely detest it. It doesn't bother me personally, but when I see it, I always instinctively think, well, that's just going to upset a big group of people. So there's a lot of that going on in this particular episode, and there's vibes of it throughout the whole thing. Obviously, it's not really a big deal, but it's just worth mentioning that Marvel have never been afraid to go kind of down the woke route. And I always think, okay, that's absolutely fine. If that's what they want to do it. It's not a problem to me. But I know it's a problem to others, and I think that makes the show a little bit grating. So when you look at things like Rotten Tomatoes scores and online reviews and all that kind of thing, always bear in mind that those scores are impacted by people who are just completely anti-woke and will just downscore everything for the sake of doing it without even having watched the show, simply because they know there's these woke elements in it. So it's just worth mentioning because I think the show overall is actually really good. When you go and you read online reviews and you see what the scores it gets on these scoring sites and all these things, just bear in mind that those scores are massively manipulated by people with an agenda. And I just think, just enjoy the show for what it's worth. and have fun. And that really is all that should matter, is that these shows are designed to entertain and to have a laugh and to enjoy, and for me to be able to talk about it and get it out on camera and share the love and the passion for these shows. So, you know, for me, it's not a problem. For others, I know it is, but hopefully people will agree with me on this channel that we're all for it. We're all for that inclusive vibe, and hopefully we'll get more of that in more shows to come. My favourite thing about this episode though, and that actually did kind of suck me back in from being a little bit bored, was the fact that we saw the return of Evan Peters. Quicksilver makes an appearance in this episode. That was one of the highlights of the entire series for me. It was actually really exciting to see him there. It's obviously a massive Easter egg, not just to WandaVision when he had appeared, but also kind of sort of throwback to Age of Ultron, kind of, but also the X-Men series as well, which is now even more relevant because it technically ties in because of what Deadpool did and all the rest of it. So, you know, it's kind of a little bit more relevant than it was at WandaVision. When Evan Peters appeared in that, it was just plain confusing. But he, as a character, he has survived the Hex. He's still alive. He's still in Westview. He's still there, and I don't think he's Quicksilver. He just seems to be a bit of a weird, creepy loner wandering around, not really knowing what to do with his life, doesn't really want to talk about Wanda, doesn't really want to talk about Agatha, is very traumatized by the events of what had happened in WandaVision. I would love them to expand on his story. I would love them to take that and run with it, and, you know, whether you want to tie it in with X-Men or whatever, that's absolutely fine. But I'd love to see a little bit more relevance for him and a little bit more of an emphasis on why he's there in the first place, and how it all connects. So a brilliant little Easter egg, a great little cameo. I really appreciated that one. We also now start seeing a little bit more depth into how Billy gets to where he is and why he originally broke into Agatha's house at the very, very beginning. We get a little bit of backstory behind all of that, and essentially he's trying to figure out who he is, because at some stage he's got amnesia and he doesn't remember the fact that he's actually Billy Maximoff. So he's dealing with the fact that he has these abilities to read people's minds. He can hear their thoughts. He doesn't really understand it, and when he woke up from a car accident, he instantly shouted out Tommy's name. So, but because he's got amnesia, he doesn't know who that is. So he's trying to figure out who he is and who Tommy is, and trying to get back to where he belongs, really, let's be honest. So it's also a case of him trying to understand his abilities and his powers. He knows there's something special about him and that's different. And episode 6 is really about him sort of making that investigation and how he ends up seeking out Agatha and trying to convince her that they need to go down the witch's road, because he wants his powers back, he wants his brother back, and he wants to get his life restored. So for him, it's a massive big deal, and he's kind of the driving force to make Agatha go down the witch's road. But it's an easy sell because she wants her powers back anyway, so she sees that she can get them back by surviving the road. Or at least that's what we're made to believe. Now we come on to episode 7, and I think, from what I've read online so far of places like Screen Rant, that a lot of people will agree with me that episode 7 is by far and away the best episode of the entire series, by miles. And the interesting thing about it is that it's not really about Agatha, it's about Lilia. So, as I said before, I love the actress that plays her. She's so good. And instantly, when it's more about her, I was hooked immediately. So that little phase where I'd gone through, that little bit of boredom midway through a show, that little bit of kind of tediousness of like just trudging through it. In episode 7, we get Lilia doing what she does, which is, we think that she's being told things, and I had initially thought that Mephisto was kind of telling her stuff, which is how she's able to divinate, come up with the names of who's in the coven. She randomly starts blurting out sentences for no apparent reason throughout the series, and we don't really understand why. The impression that you get is that someone is talking to her, which instinctively I would say, oh, well, it must be Mephisto. But actually it's not. And the way that the show is constructed is all about tarot, divination, telling the story, telling the journey. And Lilia is not actually hearing voices. She's not being told things. What actually is happening is that she can see glimpses into the past and the future constantly. Time for her is not linear. She's jumping through time loops all the way through this whole show. So when she's suddenly blurting stuff out that seems really random and seems as though maybe someone is speaking to her, it's not. It's actually because she's having conversations in other moments of time, suddenly snapping back into where she is physically. And she's just coming out with it. And actually they start bringing that all together and tying it all up. So it starts suddenly making sense. And it is brilliantly well done, superbly well choreographed, and the cinematography is beautifully put together. It is a fantastic episode. There's also a lot of suspense. There's another trial going on. Will they survive, etc., etc. So you kind of get the suspense element in there as well. But again, the acting is brilliant, and the performances from everybody really are really, really good. But in this episode, it goes up another level by miles. So by living life for Lilia basically out of time sequence and sort of glimpsing these past and future conversations whilst also still being in the present, her life is entirely out of time sequence, but that's how she can divinate. That's how she can see what's going to happen. That's why she knew who was going to be on the list of names to join the coven. It's because she's already seen it. She's already seen it happen. She knows who's supposed to be there, including herself. So the flow of time for her, she says, is an illusion, and it's not linear in any way, shape or form for her. And if anything, it's just like a great big loop flying around all over the place. So her character is obviously a little bit traumatized because it's difficult for her to understand. It's difficult for her to actually comprehend what she's seeing in the order that she's seeing it. So for her to try and figure it out is a little bit of a journey and a challenge for herself. Incredible storytelling for this one character. All of the witches do get their own time throughout these trials. It very much centres on each individual witch in each individual trial. But this one just stood out so much more. And the divination becomes really important because she also starts figuring stuff out. She doesn't just deal with the trial that they're having to deal with. She also figures out that this Rio character is actually death. She sees it, she understands it, she divinates it, she actually figures it out long before anybody else does. So Rio, the character that had appeared earlier on in the show, is now revealed as being Death, which is exactly why the Ouija board said that Death was talking to them all. It's because she was right there in the middle of the group. But not only is Rio Death, but also all roads lead to death is one of the kind of key takeaways from this episode. So it's the one thing that everybody has in common, and it's where everybody will eventually end up. And death will then go and take on a bigger role. It's really interesting because this is a very kind of, we've often wondered as like hardcore Marvel comic fans during the Infinity Saga whether Death would have appeared earlier on, because in the comics, Death is the reason why Thanos wants Infinity Stones in the Infinity Gauntlet. He's trying to impress Death because he's in love with her, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of a bit of a thing that the way that the Infinity Saga was told is that it actually didn't have anything to do with that kind of comic book story. It was something very different. So we always wondered whether Death might appear, and now she finally does. And this character called Rio is revealed as being the original Green Witch, Death herself. So it all comes out, and it comes through the divination that Lilia is doing. And ultimately, at the end, the way that they survive this trial is that Lilia has to sacrifice herself in order to actually defeat the Salem Seven as well. So she manages to kill all of them and herself in the process, but in doing so, everybody else survives the trial and they can carry on down the Witch's Road to get to the end. So an incredible episode, great storytelling, gripping drama, hugely incredible performance in that as well. This episode was peak. Like, it stood out so much more than all of the others, and I was hooked in that episode. It was so good. The problem is that it's episode 7 and we've still got 2 more, so does it then take a bit of a dip? Well, episode 8 is almost kind of the finale. It feels more like a finale than what episode 9 does later on, which is a little bit strange. But we start to actually understand why Death is there, and it's the idea that Billy and potentially Tommy, they've kind of recreated their own lives again, and obviously Billy wants to find Tommy, but in order to do that, probably has to bring him back. So in order to kind of do that, there needs to be some compensation, otherwise there's no balance between life and death. So episode 8 is all about the earth, the element of earth, which is weird because I don't remember whatever episode was supposed to have the element of air in it. Maybe someone can tell me, because I did not pick up on whatever that was. But episode 8 is definitely the earth story, and it's the idea that, you know, as things generate and blossom and bloom, things also then wither and die. So there's this element of balance to it. So if Billy wants to go and recreate Tommy in order to rescue him and save him, something's got to be given up in the process as well. So Agatha and Death actually make a deal that in order for Agatha to get her powers back and to cheat death herself, she has to basically give Billy up to death. Now, Billy doesn't know this, of course, but it's Agatha being Agatha and really being the villain, you know, making these deals to get what she wants. She doesn't really care about the outcome for anyone else. She's really just interested in getting her powers back, her goals, her agenda, cheating death, and carrying on. So you get that real villain vibe still coming through. She's still not a hero. She's still an anti-hero at best, but realistically, just a villain. We then get to kind of like the end of the trials and the end of the road, and essentially what happens is that Agatha and Billy become the last two kind of not surviving, others do survive and they get their powers and they get off the road and all this kind of thing. Some of them do die, some of them don't. But you're then left with the final two, which is Agatha and Billy. So what they eventually do in order to survive the final trial is that they have to sit down and Agatha has to basically help Billy to find Tommy. I don't think it's necessarily a case of finding Tommy though. I think it's more of a case of recreating Tommy, and another kid out there somewhere in the world unfortunately has to perish in order for Tommy to kind of enter his body and come back himself. So there's a little bit of a weird life-death balance going on throughout this whole thing. It's all about this earthly balance kind of element, storyline to it. But eventually it does actually work, and Tommy is, so far as we know, recreated. We don't see him, we don't know where he is, but we understand from the story that it actually is sort of successful. Billy then leaves because his story is fulfilled. He gets what he wants. Agatha is then left on her own to survive the final trial, which she does manage to do. And then we are instantly, suddenly then thrown back. Agatha is taken back to Westview. And as she kind of opens the doors of her basement out into her yard, there's a huge, great big storm. The original Green Witch Death is standing on her roof, cackling and laughing. And the Wizard of Oz vibes in this episode, in that scene, were undeniable. And it carries on. And that's when I realised that actually, yeah, you had these hocus pocus vibes in some of these particular episodes, the cheesier ones in particular, with the singing and the brooms and all that kind of thing. We also had little kind of darker horror elements throughout with the weird creepy animals that were turning up, these Death Eater style people that were appearing, and some weird creepy moments as well of like dead people coming back and very zombie-like people and all this kind of thing. So you had all of that going on, but actually the whole story, the whole thing is clearly just a retelling of The Wizard of Oz. The Witch's Road is clearly the Yellow Brick Road. You have this coven of witches who are clearly like the Lion and the Tin Man and blah blah blah. So it's taking all of these elements. We even have when they join on the road, they had to take their shoes off, and it just instantly reminded of when the Green Witch's boots curl up as she dies. So it's kind of like just constant throughout. Once you really get those references and those understandings, it then just accelerates and becomes a whole other thing. Because in the end, not only do you have this big confrontation between Death, the Green Witch, and Agatha, Tommy then appears, and I keep on wanting to call him Wiccan because I'm pretty sure that that's his actual superhero name. In fact, I very nearly said it earlier on in this episode. But every time I was writing my notes, I was like, he's Wiccan, he's Wiccan, he's Wiccan. And in the confrontation between Agatha and Death, at that point, Agatha doesn't have any powers, so there's nothing she can do to defeat Death until Billy turns up, and he's in his kind of Wiccan outfit. So he's gone full-on Scarlet Witch mode, and he turns up and he's got all his powers and he can do the whole Doctor Strange weird hand things and the Scarlet Witch hand things and all these kinds of stuff. And in order for Agatha to actually get her powers was never about surviving the road. In order for her to get powers, she has to be attacked by another witch and then drain that energy from them, thus killing the person that's attacking her. That's why she gets through so many covens, because she deliberately sets them up to hate her so much that they attack her, drains all of their power and kills them. It's why the Salem 7 were there in the first place. So it's kind of a bit of a thing. We start to understand that Agatha's intentions have never actually been all that honest. It was never about the road, but we'll find out more about that later on. But certainly at this point, in order for Agatha to actually go and fight Death, she needs Billy to attack her, needs him to actually blast her with his powers so that she can get hers. The difficulty is, of course, is that if she goes too far with it, Billy will die. So there's a little bit of this trust story going on between the two characters. Billy, bless him, does go and do it, does blast her with his powers and attacks her. She starts draining the life out of him and sucking in all of this power, because it's not defeating her, it's energizing her and giving her her powers back. And she starts then, like, the clothes change, and it's the big dramatic reveal that it's full-on powerful Agatha has returned, as Billy slowly starts draining away and turning into something that looks more like a skeleton. We don't know, and we don't trust Agatha. Is she going to stop it? Is she just going to carry on and let him die? But she does. She stops it. And Billy, although he sort of falls to the ground and looks a little bit ill, he does recover and he isn't killed. So he does his part, because let's be honest, Agatha does help him prior to that in recreating Tommy. I'm getting the names mixed up, so if I've said them the wrong way around before, I do apologise for that. Just go with it. So anyway, in the end of it, they've both got their powers back. This means that, in theory, Agatha and Death should be able to face off, and they do start facing off. The problem is that you can't defeat Death. You can't outrun Death. You can't prevent it. It is inevitable. She is inevitable. It's going to happen. And Agatha realizes this. Even with her powers, she is no match. She can't cheat Death. So it comes down to the original agreement between what Agatha and Death had come to. Is she going to give up Billy in order to save herself? Or Death might accept her in exchange? And to start off with, Billy gets sacrificed. Or at least that's how it starts to play out. Until Billy turns around to Agatha and says, "Is this how your son died?" And it clearly strikes a chord with Agatha, because she instantly sacrifices herself and gives herself up to Death immediately. Without any hesitation, she kind of becomes not a hero, an anti-hero. So it's that kind of final moment, and that's why it feels like the finale, really. There is another episode to come, but that was kind of the moment. She goes off with Death, and that's the end, and Agatha perishes by the end of the episode and is buried in the ground, and she's done. And that is it. And Billy then goes off, goes back home, gets into his bedroom, and he starts looking around all of the shelves in his room, and he suddenly starts to realise that he is surrounded by references to, surprise, surprise, the Wizard of Oz, the Green Witch, the shoes, Dorothy, the lion, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow. They're all there on his shelf, and then he starts to look around further, and he starts to notice that there are pictures on the wall that also appeared in the trials. There's all of these things around him, and he suddenly starts to realise he created the road himself. It wasn't Agatha that opened it. Billy actually made it. Just in the same way that Scarlet Witch had actually created the Westview Hex, Billy created the Witch's Road. He actually did it. And again, it's all of these Wizard of Oz references get thrown at you really intensely at that point, and you start to think, is it actually Billy in this story who is the Wizard of Oz character throughout this? It just becomes very apparent and really hits you hard. And as he figures it out and he goes, it was me, I made the road, and suddenly starts to feel the weight of responsibility of the people that died on it, you suddenly hear Agatha's voice come back. Cutscene, end of episode. Episode 9 goes to a bit of backstory, which was a real kind of detraction from where we were previously. It sometimes irks me a little bit that they don't just do linear storytelling. It wasn't so bad with this because it wasn't an entire episode, but when you get whole episodes where they're just backstory to fill, it really annoys me, because you get pulled away instantly from the story that you were originally watching, and mentally it just becomes a bit of a thing for me. So I find that it's a little bit difficult, but with this it wasn't too bad because it wasn't the whole thing. But you do go back to 1750 when Agatha is really young. She has her son, her baby, but the baby's going to basically be born Death. So Death turns up as she's giving birth, and she pleads and begs Death to kind of just not let it happen. And Death basically says that the best that she can do is just to give them some time. And that's essentially what they get. So Agatha and her son, he becomes a child, he grows up a little bit, but he must get to the age of about 5, 6, 7. He's really not that old. And eventually in one night, Death just comes and takes him away very naturally. Nothing scary about it. She just appears and he walks off with her and he dies. But what this tells us is that all of the weird rumour stories about the fact that he was sacrificed to get the Darkhold were never true. That was never true. It was just basically a rumour that had been told about Agatha by other witches that they'd conjured up and created this story in their heads to make her seem like she was really evil and the villain. And she is, but it wasn't the way that it actually happened. There was nothing malicious about the way that her son had died in the end. But what this does do is it tells us then why it is that Agatha becomes a witch in the first place and how she gets her powers. Because originally her and her son go around hunting witches, not being one of them. So there's a bit of a shift. And when her son dies, this witch kind of appears through the woods and had heard Agatha singing the song that her and her son would sing together, which just happens to be the song that they use to try to open the Witch's Road later at the beginning of the series. There is a reason for that. But this random witch kind of walks up to her while she's in mourning and singing the song and says, "That sounds like the song that will open the Witch's Road. Can you guide me and can you take me?" And Agatha, being the big villain, realises that this is actually not an opportunity to go down the Witch's Road. She never wanted to go down the Witch's Road, never has done. What she wants to do is to get a coven of witches together to kill them all, to literally get them so wound up and so aggressive that they all attack her, blast her with the powers so that she can absorb them, gain her own power and strength, and kill the rest of them. And that happens century after century after century, right up until this new story. Agatha never intended to go down the Witch's Road. She's never been down the Witch's Road. She never got her powers by going down that route. She got her powers by setting other witches up, creating these covens where other witches believed that Agatha was going to take them down the Witch's Road, but in actual fact they were being set up as lambs to slaughter, and Agatha would just wipe them all out. Coven after coven after coven after coven, and that is exactly her same kind of MO, if you like, in this series as well, with these new witches that she brings together at the beginning of this show. The difference though is that in this case, once they start singing that song to open the road, it actually opens, which has never happened to Agatha before, and she doesn't really understand why until Billy walks down the stairs as the moment that the door appears for them to go down the Witch's Road, and she very quickly figures out who he is and the fact that he made it and he had that power. So her going down the Witch's Road with him was probably a little bit of a deviation from her original strategy. She actually just wanted to kill off all of the other witches that they'd assembled and take their powers so that she had her own back. She couldn't have cared less about going down the Witch's Road, but once she started to recognise that Billy had these powers and had created it, she kind of had no choice but to go along with it and go down the road and go down that route. So it was a little bit of a weird kind of twist because, okay, she's a villain, but we really see that now. And okay, maybe she made the sacrifice play in the episode before, so you start to see her as more of an anti-hero. But actually now, no, she was full-on villain the whole time. She never intended for anything other than killing all of them, which is why there's never really been that much trust between any of these characters. And they play it the whole way through from beginning to end, which is brilliant storytelling because actually you're always expecting Agatha to turn into a hero at some point because it's the typical kind of Marvel thing, but it never happens. She starts as a villain because that's how she ends in WandaVision, and she finishes as a full-on villain as well with this actual truth coming out as to what it was that she wanted. So brilliant storytelling and very, very unique, I think, from what we've seen before with these kinds of Marvel shows and films. They've never really had anything like that before. So very, very good. Really, really appreciated it. It was definitely very well done. In the end though, and we flash back to Billy being back in his bedroom and he had suddenly heard Agatha's voice, he turns around and it's actually Agatha's ghost because she dies in the episode before. So here we now have Agatha is no longer a witch, Agatha is a ghost. And there's a lot of toing and throwing and backstory and talking and blah 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 this and blah 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 that, but ultimately in the end, at the very, very end, Agatha is nothing more than a ghost, and she agrees to go off with Billy to help him find Tommy. And that is how the series ends. So let's get back to the original question. Is Agatha pointless? Well, by the end of the series, she's dead. So yeah, From things that I've read online, a lot of people have said that maybe this is now where they go off and they can kind of like bring Scarlet Witch back. But a lot of times through the show, they confirm that she's definitely dead. And although I do believe that Scarlet Witch is going to come back in things like Secret Wars and stuff like that, there's other ways to do it through the multiverse. So you don't necessarily need this whole witchy thing going on. So is Agatha pointless? Yes, in my opinion, it is. Because there's nothing at the end of that which leaves me excited for more or think that it's relevant for tying things in. Ultimately, what's going to happen? Well, Billy's going to go off and find Tommy, and then you've got this duo double act being weirdly guided by the ghost of Agatha. So there's kind of just this kind of weird feeling at the end of it where, okay, there's obviously a story that they can go and they can tell, and there's enough threads that they can pick up on and all these kinds of things. But none of them are threads that are interesting to me. Will they kind of come together and find a way to bring Scarlet Witch back? Is she even dead? No one really seems to know. But as I say, realistically, I don't think you need Billy or Tommy or Agatha to bring Scarlet Witch back, which realistically is the only goal, surely, in terms of the grand scheme of things, and with the new movies that are coming out, the Avengers films that are coming, with Secret Wars and all of these things. Surely that's the goal, is to bring back Wanda, because if it's not that, then I don't see any point whatsoever. But presumably that is the thread. You know, if Billy, with the help of Agatha's ghost, can go off and find Tommy, maybe it's a way for them to start doing young Avengers, because obviously you've got the two of them there. They're just teenage kids, so they could go down that road. And there's obviously other characters that could get drawn into that and tied up in it as well, like Ms. Marvel and things like that. So there's obviously a road that they can go down with that if they really wanted to. I don't think at the moment that there is anything on the slate for there being a Young Avengers movie, but it has routinely been kind of an undercurrent for things. Where you got like Ironheart as well as another young one that's appearing as well. So I kind of feel like there's an inevitability to it. Maybe they'll tie that into the Secret Wars story, I'm not really sure. But the difficulty is you don't need Billy and Tommy to do any of that. You could bring Scarlet Witch back in any number of ways. Maybe she didn't destroy all of the Darkholds. Maybe there is another one somewhere. Or maybe Doctor Strange can do it. You know, there are other ways. And I'm pretty sure that when I did my review of Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, I had a theory as to where there could be another Darkhold. I'm pretty sure that there is a way to do it. May also tie in with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as well, although technically slightly separated now from the MCU. But there is a way. There is another one out there, in my opinion, that they could tie up. Because if memory serves, I think Ghost Rider took it to hell, I think, is how it ended in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So tie that story in, because that's way more interesting. Come on, Ghost Rider, please. So is Agatha pointless? Well, yes, I think so. I don't really think that this show had much point to it. And pretty much for the last year, whenever I reviewed anything that's been coming up and I've been thinking about what's coming later in the year, at no point have I ever had any excitement whatsoever for this show. I did enjoy it. I did like it. It was very watchable. It was very different. It felt very much like its own thing. So it was kind of fun and enjoyable and watchable, and I liked it. I didn't love it, but I liked it. I didn't hate it, as opposed to things like Thor: Love and Thunder, which I really genuinely wish I had never seen. But ultimately, I do think it's a little bit of a pointless thing, and probably, well, definitely a one-off thing, because the main character obviously is Agatha, who dies by the end of the series. So definitely a one-off thing. Is it content for content's sake? Probably. I feel like this was one of the shows that was kind of greenlit at a time where they were just churning it out over and over and over again without really much consideration to the quality of it. But it is a quality show. It is good. It is very watchable. I did enjoy it. So yes, it's good. Yes, it's worth watching. I wouldn't expect any massive tie-in with anything else or anything that kind of connects back to the MCU, other than just these references to Wanda and to WandaVision. Other than that, you're not going to get a lot out of it. So is it pointless? Yeah. But is it watchable? Yeah. And on that note, I would say it's still worth watching. Go watch it. Obviously, if you haven't already, please do. It is worth seeing. So with that said, and on that terrible disappointment, it is now time to end. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. The vlog is over.